Welcome back for another Marengo episode. Part of the reason I'm doing this is because I've found some semi-regular opponents in London, so thank you to all of those opponents. This episode is going to be about openings. At 6 o'clock, the Austrian move is quite limited. They need to get troops on the table as quickly as possible, and that means one unit in the lead, either on the northern or the southern road. In your opening games, you might notice a pattern to this. The Austrians move along it, the French just organise units, and before the French know what is happening, their defence in the north has been overwhelmed without even a shot being fired. And as you close in on midday, the whole thing begins to look like an Austrian breakthrough. Fortunately for the French, they can, on the first turn, simply block the northern road by spending one of their orders moving a unit rather than organising units. And in your first few games, when they do that, you'll tend to see positions where the Austrians are bottled up and must batter their way across the Fontanon River, which in early games feels very difficult. And it is frustration with this sort of position that will likely lead players to consider Rachel's Gambit as an opening. Suggested in an example of play at the back of the rules by the designer Rachel Simmons, it works like this. On turn 1, an Austrian cavalry takes the southern road and uses a continuation move to advance onto the approach. This is deeply counterintuitive, as you are directing units south, but the objective is actually to open up freedom of movement in the north. Why does it work? Let's begin with the Gambit accepted. Assuming the French have a cavalry unit southwest of Marengo, they can organise the locale for 2 orders, then use a third order to make a manoeuvre attack by road to Peterbona. Because the Austrians cannot respond to the attack to block the approach, they have no units in reserve because their cavalry is on the approach to the zone northwest of Marengo, the attack succeeds. That means the French cavalry takes the locale. The Austrian cavalry takes 1 loss and retreats. The Austrians lose a morale for that loss, and they commit 1 morale to the locale, a potential loss of 2 morale. I say potential because in reality the Austrians only lose 1 morale in this situation. At 7 o'clock they can now make their own manoeuvre attack back into Peterbona. The French unit can respond to this, but because it is a wide approach, the Austrians could then conduct another manoeuvre attack which the French would not be able to defend. So the French cavalry has no choice but to withdraw. The Austrians have now retaken that locale, so the committed morale is safe at the end of their turn. From here, the Austrians have a variety of options, but the key point is that they can now drive a unit along the northern road, getting past the choke point and over the river, where the French would normally block them on the first turn. They could end up in a position something like this, though not exactly like this, and I'll explain why in a moment. The reason I'm going to go into that is that this is not an opening to play in a learning game. It is way too sharp. By that, I do not mean that the Austrians gain some huge advantage. I mean that either player can easily make a mistake that completely wrecks their game. To illustrate, this specific position I am depicting is actually an Austrian mistake. To understand, let's look at this from the French point of view at 7 a.m. The French here should begin with a manoeuvre attack from the south into Peterbona. The Austrians can respond and block this, but if they do, they commit a morale to the locale and move the cavalry to the approach. The problem for the Austrians is if there is a French cavalry northwest of Marengo, which is about a 1 in 3 chance, then there is no Austrian unit left to stop a manoeuvre attack by that cavalry. Yes, the French need 2 orders to organise the locale, but a cavalry unit does not need an order to make a manoeuvre attack by a main road. and manoeuvre attacks don't limit further movement into the zone, so the second unit in that locale can move in, and the French will then be able to hold Peterbona for a turn, and thus, in total, claim 3 Austrian morale. Note, the French can in this situation also increase the pressure on the Austrians by moving even disorganised units up to approaches, so you end up with a final position something like this. An Austrian player might still look at this and say it was a price worth paying to open the northern road. That's not really the point I'm trying to make here, though. The point I'm trying to make is that that's 3 morale which hinged on the placement of a single Austrian unit. And that is what I meant by the opening being sharp. As you get more experienced, you should get used to this. It is how cutthroat and decisive engagements tend to be in the open ground east of the Fontaine River, but it's definitely something to avoid with a new player. Okay, let's go back to the start and look at the Gambit again. Now, the whole point in a Gambit is to sacrifice something, in this case a point of Austrian morale, to achieve a positional advantage. But Gambits can be declined, and I think it is useful psychologically when you start playing to see that the French can do that in this case. They can just ignore the threat and make the blocking move they intended to make in the first place. So, here is the position. The French have blocked the northern approach, but they're going to lose the locale northwest of Marengo. Let us assume that they have 2 two-point infantry there. They cannot respond to the attack, so one of those infantry will lose 1 point, and then both will retreat to adjacent locales. Unlike the Austrians, they don't commit morale for retreating, so the total loss is still just 1 morale. Because units retreating from a disorganised locale disorganise the locale they go into, the French player's retreat is effectively governed by the decision they made on their turn about which locale to organise. In this case, they retreat south, but I can see plenty of arguments for retreating east. The Austrians will need to reinforce that cavalry. It can, in theory, be attacked twice, but the key point is that the French will have no difficulty forming a defence on the Fontaine River, and what the French have done here is to say if it was worth the Austrians giving up 1 morale to open the northern road, it is worth the French giving up 1 morale to close it. And we could end the analysis here, but I think it's worth exploring one other option. So let's return to the initial Austrian move and talk about the sidestep. French units cannot move to approaches on the first turn, but they can still move. Why not simply move the 2 threatened units out of the way? And while we're at it, why not block the northern road in the process? This seems, at a stroke, to have confounded the Austrian Gambit. The northern approach is now held in strength, and the Austrian advance halted. And actually, it's worth noting you can play this against any southern opening, even if it is not a Gambit. But it is not quite that simple. It is still quite a sharp position. The southern front around Marengo is now much weaker than it would be in most games, so if you're not used to that, that might affect your play. And those 2 French units actually moved a locale closer to the Austrian entry point. They can be placed under a lot of pressure. I'm not saying there is some secret flaw, just making the point that this is a very different opening than you might be used to after your first few games. I've talked before about how rote learning comes some way down the line from tactical play. So this video is a little bit out of order in my thoughts on Marengo. But precisely because this opening creates a very sharp position and thus will hone your tactical skills, I think once you and an opponent have got the rules down, it's worth playing it and trying different French responses. Accepting the Gambit is not suicidal. One of the things I think you will begin to learn is that your French response will rest a lot on your initial distribution of troops. And I think there's a lot more detail I could go into about this opening. I've only touched on the surface, but I thought it was a useful one to raise. I think it's an interesting one to play, and it might give you, if you're starting out, a new appreciation of the range of possibilities early in the game for both the French and the Austrians. If you've tried it, feel free to share your own experiences in the comments, and next time I will get back to tactics. For now, here endeth the lesson.